Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Mursaleen. We are looking at, we are continuing our reading of Iqbal's Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, the first chapter, and we were looking at his claims about, his claim that logical understanding, what he calls sometimes analytic understanding, which seems to be the same thing as what we have in Kant, the Kantian notion of understanding. Iqbal thinks that logical understanding cannot see unity behind multiplicities, because and also logical understanding is incapable of seeing this multiplicity as a coherent universe, because in order to see a coherent universe we need to see the unity behind this multiplicity, not the superficial unity which is the outcome of generalization, but the real unity which comes through seeing reality from within. So he said, in fact, the logical understanding is incapable of seeing this multiplicity as a coherent universe. Its only method is generalization based on resemblances, but its generalizations are only fictitious unities which do not affect the reality of concrete things. So that's just the external relations. In its deeper movement, however, thought is capable of reaching an immanent infinite, in whose self-unfolding movement the various finite concepts are merely moments. Now, this claim about the inability of logical understanding to see the real unity is wedged between Iqbal's claim here that the idea that thought is essentially finite and for this reason unable to capture the infinite is based on a mistaken notion of the movement of thought in knowledge. And then he starts about it is the inadequacy of the logical understanding which finds a multiplicity of mutually repellent individualities with no prospects of their ultimate reduction to a unity. And then it goes on again, goes back to the infinity. In its deeper movement, however, thought is capable of reaching an immanent infinite in whose self-unfolding movement the various finite concepts are merely moments. So what I want to say is that his claim about the inability of logical understanding to see the real unities are closely connected with his claims about the false infinity and genuine infinity. And I think that the solution he presents about overcoming the opposition between finite and infinite are the same solution which he is suggesting here for overcoming the limitation of logical understanding and seeing real unity behind multiplicity. So we'll look at this today. So logical understanding or analytic understanding or understanding itself per se is incapable of discovering the unity behind multiplicity. Multiplicity. And why understanding is incapable of doing that is because the method of understanding is based on two things basically. First is that it understands things from outside. Outside of the things. So it means that it basically presupposes the opposition between thinking and things, or thinking and being. That's the basic opposition. If thinking and being are totally opposite things, then thinking can only understand being from outside. It cannot penetrate within being, or cannot understand being from within. There is always going to be a veil of darkness, or veil of ignorance, or veil of opposition, whatever you want to call it. So that's the first thing. That's the reason why understanding cannot understand the real unity, cannot see the real unity behind multiplicity, and why its unities are all fictitious. And I guess the second point is just a corollary of the first one, or not, I'm not sure, is that then the things themselves, those multiple things themselves, are seen as opposed to each other, limiting each other, outside each other. So these are the two main points, or main reason why understanding cannot see. First is it sees things from outside, and that's because the basic opposition between thinking and things, which is presupposed here in this biological understanding. So, and if things and thinking are two totally opposite and different things, then thinking can only, if at all, understand things from outside. And the second thing is, within things itself, it sees things as individuated and limiting each other. And I guess both these points flow from Hegel's according to Hegel and Iqbal, the basic opposition between finite and infinite. And if we can overcome the basic opposition between finite and infinite, or basic dichotomy between finite and infinite, then we can overcome this opposition between thinking and things, and we will also be able to overcome the basic gulf between things, individual things as well, and we will be able to see everything from within as a unity, as one thing, basically. Yeah, so this is the argument. And how does Hegel overcome the dichotomy or distinction between finite and infinite, or finite and infinite, this opposition? We have rehearsed this argument before, but we'll try this time with this special connection to our argument so far today. So basically, Hegel's argument is that the bad conception of infinity, or bad or false notion of infinity, is a notion in which finite is seen as outside infinite, because if finite is outside infinite, it means it's limiting infinite from outside. Or in other words, infinite is not infinite because it is not included in where finite is. So and in order to overcome this opposition, this dilemma, or this dilemma, I guess, or this contradiction, we need, Hegel says, we need a conception of genuine infinity, or true infinity. And within true infinity, we overcome this opposition between finite and infinite by abandoning the basic opposition between So in order to overcome this contradiction, what we need to do is to abandon the basic assumption through which this contradiction arises, and that's the basic assumption is the opposition between finite and infinite. And the only way the infinite can be infinite if it in effect absorbs, we looked at this, or incorporate finite as its internal moment. Or internal differentiation. So the only way to avoid the contradiction is to abandon the idea that finite and infinite are outside each other, then we'll see finite as within infinite. So there's nothing else but infinite, or the whole. So there's one whole, or one organism, or one being, or one thinking. There's only one. And thinking and being are the distinctions or differentiation within that one. So, in fact, we end up with a sort of monism. And one way of reading Hegel is to say that in order to avoid the contradiction which arise from the traditional opposition between finite and infinite, we need to suppose, or we need to assume that finite is part of infinite. And if finite is part of infinite, there is no opposition. Finite is just a particular way of looking at infinite. And infinite is a particular way of looking at finite, I guess, in some sense. And the basic shift from the epistemological perspective is that instead of seeing finite and infinite and their relationship from outside, or externally, what we need to do is to see these relationships internally or from within. And if we see this relationship from outside, we see this relationship from within, and then we realize that infinite is infinite, not because it goes on forever, but because it contains finite or finitude within itself. So if finite is within infinite, it means that infinite is no longer restricted by something which is outside itself. So that's the basic epistemological shift. And this epistemological shift can be regarded as, or can be seen as a supposition or a hypothesis or an insight, depending on your perspective. But its purpose is to overcome the basic dichotomy between finite and infinite. And once the dichotomy between finite and infinite is resolved and the epistemological shift occurs, then we can also resolve the problem with logical understanding. And logical understanding is, in a sense, based on the image of the opposition between finite and infinite. So once that opposition is gone and we see things from within, then we will see the real unities, because we will know that everything is part of one infinite. So all finite multiplicities are part of one real unity. And thinking itself finds that it's not opposed to being what it is, with being part of something which is singular, which is the whole. So in a sense, thinking and being are part of the same reality. So they are not opposed to each other. So if we take these perspectives, then we will be able to see the real unity behind the multiplicity of the things. And as I said, this is not to say that logical understanding is not needed, but only to say that for the real understanding, we need to go beyond logical understanding. So this is the argument. Let's go back. Let's read from here so we can see the continuity. The idea that thought is essentially finite and for this reason unable to capture the infinite is based on a mistaken notion of the movement of thought in knowledge. So the mistaken notion is that thinking is opposite to or outside things or being. So once we know that knowledge is not once we know that knowledge is not thinking plus things, where thing and thinking are opposed to each other, but knowledge is thinking meeting things from within. That's the real knowledge. And understanding their mutual relationship from within by connecting to the whole or the infinite of which they are part. And we get rid of the idea of the finitude of thought, which Kant propagated in a sense, or other people before him like Ghazali, because thought, there's no problem with finitude of thought, because this finitude is part of a moment of infinite. So it means that thought can relate to infinite and capture the infinite from within, because thought is part of that or the moment of that infinite. So the idea that thought is essentially finite and for this reason unable to capture the infinite is based on a mistaken notion of the movement of thought in knowledge. It is the inadequacy of the logical understanding, that is the understanding which is based on the idea of opposition between finite and infinite, which finds the multiplicity of mutually repellent individualities with no prospects of their ultimate reduction to a unity, that makes us skeptical about the conclusiveness of thought. What lies behind the idea of the limitation of thought and inconclusiveness of thought is the basic opposition between finitude and infinity, And once that basic opposition is overcome, we see that thought is part and parcel of the reality of things. In fact, the logical understanding is incapable of seeing this multiplicity as coherent universe. Its only method is generalization based on resemblances, but its generalizations are only fictitious unities. They are fictitious unities because they are based on the fundamental opposition between thought and being, finite and infinite, and fundamental distinction within being itself, which do not affect the reality of concrete things. So generalization doesn't relate things from within. In its deeper movement, however, thought is capable of reaching an immanent infinite. Why? Because thought is not opposed to being, and also thought is not finite as such, because there's no opposition between finite and infinite. And thought is part of infinite from within. It can see, if we take a switch, or take a epistemological switch, or epistemological break from the idea of the opposition between finite and infinite and thought and being, then we can see the real relationship between things from within. In its deeper movement, our thought is capable of reaching an immanent infinite, which is that one to which everything is related. In whose self-unfolding movement, the various finite concepts are merely moments. So once the thought can see how it is related to infinite as part or as moment of that, or moments of that infinite, then it can understand things from within and its relationship with the whole universe. In its essential nature, then thought is not. Okay, so we just stop here and I will continue from here next time.